Fantastic. Well, it's brilliant to be together today and to just have a chance to be able to share with you something of God's word and what it is that he's wanting to remind us of and speak into our lives today. Because, it's tough, isn't it? We're in another kind of lockdown and I don't think any of us like it this way. How many of you are kind of just looking forward to the end of lockdown? How many of you are looking forward to the day when you can go to the shops without wearing a mask? How many of you are looking forward to the day when you can give your friends or your grandkids a hug? How many of you are looking forward to the day when you can simply go out and make plans and go to places and see people without having to think about a whole load of extra kind of restrictions and rules and different things? How many of you are looking forward to the day when the news isn't kind of dominated with the number of people who are suffering? I know I am. I don't like the world that we are living in, and I am longing to see better days. And we're not the first group of people to kind of feel like this. One of the reasons that I love the Bible is because it is so honest with us. God is so honest to us through the Bible. It's real. And it gives us a framework within which then we can learn and we kind of know how to then respond in the midst of the world that we're living into. And there was a group of people who felt much like we did, even if it was for very different reasons. They didn't like the world that they were living in. They faced suffering. They were treated badly. They were even treated badly by the people that they were trying to treat well. And it was this group of people that Peter was writing to when he wrote the letter that we now call 1 Peter. And in it he writes about those who in the midst of the hard times are longing, desiring life, desiring to see good days. Who are longing to see better days. And I think that longing, that desire describes so many of us right now. It definitely describes me. And what Peter says is, if you desire life, if you desire to see good days, it won't simply come by waiting for everything in the world to change. It's not going to come by just waiting for the world to get better. These are the bad days, these are hard days, these are difficult days, and we're just going to kind of grit our teeth and wait it out, and the better days are to come. No. Instead, Peter gives us some clear direction about how we engage with the world, how we see and understand things, how we relate to people and the opportunities that we have, so that even in the midst of hard times, we may know that we are blessed. That even in the midst of difficult times, we would be able to enjoy good days. And I want to sum up the kind of directions that Peter gives us in 3 things, 3 instructions. That we would seek peace, that we would be prepared, and that we would focus on Jesus. And it was great to have Alex share last week. He did a great job on the first part of 1 Peter 3. And I just want to start by revisiting the kind of verses that he finished with, because they really set the context and the framework for what Peter goes on to say. And he's talking about how we respond in the face of evil and suffering. And in that, Peter writes this. He says, "For those who desire life, and desire to see good days." That's all of us, isn't it? "Let them keep their tongues from evil and their lips from speaking deceit. Let them turn away from evil and do good. Let them seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." What's the first thing that Peter tells us to do? if we desire to see good days in the midst of hard times, he tells us to seek peace, to pursue peace with all people. He says when things are hard, when you're hurting, when we don't like what's going on around us, when we don't like the way that someone has treated us, he says don't react in kind. Don't kind of lash out or try and get your own back. Don't allow anger or hurt to kind of dictate the way that you respond. He says in a world full of kind of diverse opinions and different perspectives politically and culturally that are emotive, that people can have strong feelings about and that seemingly put us on opposite sides to other people, don't look to tear down and force your way of seeing things on others. Seek peace and pursue it. You know, what he says is what we seek is not just to win an argument, but to win people. It's not just to win an argument, but to be at peace. And I don't need to talk about this too much because I say Alex did a great job last week, so have a listen to his message. But what I want to do is just give you an example of how we see this kind of unpacked and lived out in the Bible itself. I'm not going to read it to you, but have a look during this week at Romans chapter 14. Paul is writing to the church there in Rome about issues that were deeply divisive between Jews and Gentiles. And these were emotional issues. These were issues that people felt had strong feelings about. They were passionate about. And Paul had his own opinion too. And he's not shy about it. He has his own opinion about who is right, and he was willing to argue his point from Scripture. He doesn't shy away from that and just kind of, be quiet or back down. But while he had his own opinion, and he wasn't afraid to express why and to argue for it, he chose to make peace his priority rather than just winning the argument. Paul said he would rather downplay his convictions on these issues in the church than see disagreement on them destroy the unity of the body. This is what it looks like to seek peace. You care more about your brothers and sisters and unity in Christ than you do about having people agree with you, than you do about a specific issue. And I'm not going to pretend that this is always easy. It's hard when you're passionate about something. It's hard when your emotions get involved. When you're deeply convinced that something is right. Now, here's a couple of things that I try and do. And to be honest, I don't always get it right. But these are a couple of things that I try to do when I'm in this kind of situation. Maybe they're helpful for you, maybe they're not. But number one, be willing to listen and really try to see things the way that the other person does. Try to understand why they're coming from the place that they're coming from, why they are so convinced and hold a particular conviction, what their concerns are and their priorities are. And before you offer your opinion, check that you've heard them right, that you've understood them right. Try to reflect back to them what you think they're saying so that you're not just trying to win an argument and kind of seize the first opportunity to get your own point across or to fix a problem, but you're really looking to seek to understand where they're coming from. And then number two, be willing to be the one who has got it wrong. Be willing to be the one whose opinion needs to change. Have the humility to accept that sometimes it's going to be you that's made the mistake. Sometimes it's going to be you're thinking on something that's not quite right. And I think when we when we handle ourselves in that way, when we do those two things, it transforms the way that we disagree with people. Because we're valuing the person more than just kind of winning over the issue that's at hand. And that's not to say that the issue isn't important. And that's not to say that we'll always end up in a place of agreeing with one another, or that we even need to. But that in the way that we disagree, we are prioritizing being at peace with one another over being right and winning an argument. If you want to see good days in the midst of difficult times, because difficult times polarize people, so if you want to see good days in the midst of difficult times, and the starting point, Peter tells us, is to seek peace and pursue it. But peace won't always be possible. Wish it was. Really do wish it was. But peace isn't always possible. Sometimes when we try our best to treat people well, to handle disagreements well, it still doesn't work out. The other person doesn't want to play ball in that way, and they still kind of react badly or treat us badly. Sometimes when we try to do the right things, bad things still happen. And so the second thing that Peter says is to be prepared. He writes, "Now who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Keep your conscience clear, so that when you are maligned, those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil." Over the last kind of chapter or so, Peter has talked a lot about how we relate to people. He's talked a lot about treating people well, and kind of submitting to people, and to, honoring husbands and loving wives and all of that kind of stuff. He's talked about all of this stuff because through the way that we treat people, he says we display something of who Jesus is, and they are won over to Christ through our behavior. But now he's real and he's honest with us. That even when we treat people well, there will be times when they will still want to harm us and be against us. Even as followers of Jesus, trying to live the right way and do good in this life, we can still face hard times and times of suffering. And we need to be prepared for that, so that in those days, our faith stands firm. And as Peter says, you can suffer as a result of doing evil. He says it's better to suffer for doing good, but you can suffer for doing evil. It's like, avoid that. That's not a good thing. No, that's not the what it is that you want. You can suffer as a result of your own bad choices, but there's no real joy in that. Avoid bringing suffering on yourself. Think Jonah in the Bible. He suffered in the belly of the fish because he ran from God, because of his own bad choices. You can also suffer as a direct result of doing good, doing the right thing. Think Joseph in the Bible, like Ali talks about right at the start of the service. He was sold into slavery. He was landed in prison for doing the right thing, for following God and wanting to honor him in the way that he lived. But God used his suffering for good. He turned what was meant for evil into something good to bring salvation to others as Joseph was raised up into a place of influence. And then sometimes we can suffer and we have no idea why. Think Job in the Bible. There's questions and doubts in it. We can wrestle in the midst of it. We can cry out to God. But even in that time, God is at work. We might not fully understand why. We might not fully understand what God is doing. But we see in Job that God is still at work to teach us, to grow us, to change us, and ultimately to bless us. We need to be prepared to suffer. We need to teach our children to be prepared that at times that it's going to be hard. And we suffer. And the key way that Peter kind of talks about preparing ourselves is by preparing our hearts. He says, do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. He is calling on us as followers of Jesus to have such a vision of who God is, such a vision of Christ as Lord, that it completely changes our perspective and the way that we see things and our attitude toward things. That we don't get caught up in all the different things that cause other people to fear. That we're not intimidated by people and whether they like us or not, or how it's going to work out between us. We're not worried and scared of what people think of us. Because those things have been put into perspective. They've been put into perspective by revering Christ as Lord. They've been put into perspective because we have a right fear of the Lord. That means that what matters to us most is not comfort. That means we fear the things other people fear. It is not pleasing people. That means that we can be intimidated by how they might react. But is simply pleasing Him. You see, our fear reveals what matters to us most. What we're clinging to in our hearts and we don't want to lose. And in the midst of difficult times, as God kind of shakes us, He's bringing those things to the surface so that what has been hidden in our hearts, sometimes even from ourselves, that we've not even realized is going on in there, is revealed. So that He can work in our hearts and teach us not to fear what they fear and not to be intimidated, but in our hearts to revere Christ as Lord. And when this kind of transformation of our hearts occurs, it means that when we feel the squeeze, when we're under pressure of difficult times, we don't buckle and we don't fear. Because we are looking to Jesus, because we are rooted in Him, because our hope is in Him. He is the one that we are clinging to and we are committed to in our hearts. And that transforms the way that we live. Because we're not afraid of the things other people are afraid of anymore. And so we're empowered to live differently. We're not afraid of what people might say or the way people might treat us. And so we're empowered to live differently. And that causes people to start to ask, why? Peter says, when you go through difficult times, when you go through hard times and suffering with hope and unshakable joy, people will be curious and they will ask you how, and they will ask you why. Give us the reason for your hope. And this makes me ask myself a question. I've been asking myself it a little bit this week, and I want to encourage you to ask yourself the question too. Am I living my life in such a way that people see that I have hope? Am I living my life in such a way that people see that I have hope? When is the last time that someone asked you about why you are so generous? Why are you so forgiving? Why are you so patient? Why are you so full of peace and joy and always with a smile on your face? Because this was the story of the early church. This was what made the world sit up and pay attention to the message of Jesus. It was because the followers of Jesus lived in a way that blew everyone's mind, in a way that demonstrated hope. They loved one another and they cared for the poor. You know, there are so many powerful stories of the early church putting this into action that I'm struck by. I mean, one of them I was talking about James with it this week. You know, in the city of Rome, they had their own way of dealing with unwanted children, their own kind of abortion system, which was pretty horrendous. If you had a child that you didn't want, usually if it was a girl, you would just take that child, take that newborn baby and place it in the rubbish heap and leave it there. That was the norm. And what the Christians did, what the early church did, is they started to walk among the rubbish heaps, listening out for the cries of the babies, searching them out, seeking them out so that they could rescue these children and bring them into their homes and raise them as their own. And it blew people's minds, and they looked on and said, "Why? Why do you live so differently?" And this is a massive challenge to us personally, and a massive challenge to us corporately, to live so differently that it provokes people to ask questions. And when they ask, what do you say? Peter says, be prepared to give an answer for the reason of the hope that you have. What is the reason for your hope that you can then share with them? And I'd love you to take some time this week to really think about that question, to actually try and answer that question. I encourage you to write down your answer, bullet point sentences, however it works for you, but to write down, to answer that question. What is the reason for your hope? And as you do that, invite God into the process. This can be so powerful. It helps us to be prepared to answer when people ask the question. To kind of do what Peter's telling us to do, to prepare ourselves for the answer. But at the same time, it stirs our hearts in fresh hope because of all that God has done. And we kind of remind ourselves of the hope we have in Him. And so it helps us then to stay in that place of hope. It helps us then to come to that place of praise and thanksgiving and to honor Him. And at the same time, it creates space. As we're real and honest with God, as we invite Him into that process, it creates space for God to reveal things in our heart that we maybe didn't even realize were there. So that we can then ask Him to help us to change. To transform you from the inside out. So that you do not fear what they fear, and you are not intimidated, but in your heart you revere Christ as Lord. In your heart you fear the Lord. In your heart you have a flame that is ablaze with love for Him. In this time when so many people, including many of us, are finding things difficult, how can the way that you respond put on display something of the hope that you have in Jesus? Cause people to ask questions of you. What is the hope that you have? And when people ask that question, how can you be prepared to share Jesus with others? Because when we are so filled with the hope we have in Jesus, when we revere Christ above everything else, then we will see good days. We will experience blessing. We will have good days in the midst of difficult times. And when we have opportunities then to see God not only at work in us, but through us, to share Jesus with others, to share the reason for our hope with others, then those days only get better. So Peter tells us first to seek peace. Second, to be prepared. And the last thing that I just want to draw from these verses is to focus on Jesus. Having talked about the fact that we will all go through difficult times and suffering as we look to live life God's way, Peter then points us to Jesus as our example. He writes, "For Christ also suffered, once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who was gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him." Now, there's a huge amount in these verses, and it's not all easy to understand. In fact, these are often talked about as some of the hardest and most confusing verses in the whole Bible. And so I don't want to get sidetracked from what Peter's really focused on here and what he's encouraging us to focus on Jesus and his death and resurrection and his victory. But really quickly, what does Peter mean when he says that Jesus went and preached to the spirits in prison who were disobedient in the days of Noah? Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. It could be that after his death, Jesus went and proclaimed his victory to a group of spirits who had been disobedient in Noah's day, possibly the fallen angels talked about in Genesis 6. It could be that between his death and resurrection, Jesus preached to the sinners who died in the flood at the time of Noah. Or it could be that just as Peter talks about how Christ by the Spirit preached through the Old Testament prophets in the first chapter of 1 Peter, that here he's talking about Christ by the Spirit preached through Noah to the people who were disobedient to God in his day, but that they didn't listen. And that's why only a few 8 people were saved when they responded to God's message in faith and got on the ark. And then, how does Peter get from there to baptism? And what does he mean when he says that baptism now saves you? Come on, hang on a second. I thought it was Jesus' sacrifice that saved me, that all of those who responded to Jesus with repentance and made him Lord were saved. Well, it's God, isn't it, who saves Noah? God provides the way for Noah to be saved. Noah then responds in faith, and that faith is outwardly outworked through building and getting on the ark. And in the same way, Jesus is the one who saves us. His death and resurrection makes the way for us to be saved. We are saved when we respond in faith to Jesus and make him Lord. As we appeal to him for a clean conscience. That's what Peter says. Our faith is then outwardly expressed, outwardly outworked through baptism. Now, we could talk about this a whole lot more, but I don't want to do, as I said, is to get caught up in technicalities and sidetracked with these verses and miss what Peter is really focused on. Really, what he's saying to us is, if you want to experience good days in the midst of difficult times, focus on Jesus. Focus on Jesus and his death, his resurrection, and his victory. That he is on the throne. Keep Jesus as your focus. And Peter reminds us, in our difficult times, when we might feel like we're suffering, that Christ suffered too. And reminding ourselves of Christ's suffering should stir up in us that living hope that we've been talking about over the last few weeks, because Christ died once for all sins. He died in our place. Why? To bring us to God. So that we could be forgiven and made new, so that we could have a relationship with God, so that we could have confidence that the best is yet to come, that we have eternity to look forward to. We have a living hope in difficult times. We can know good days in the midst of difficult times because Christ died for us. And Christ's suffering should give us hope because it shows us that we serve an amazing God who works in the midst of suffering, who works in the midst of the most difficult times, the times that you look at and say, how can any good come out of that? He works in those times to bring about the greatest good. That's how God worked through Christ's suffering. And so when we face difficult times, when we kind of face times and we're not sure how we're going to cope, know that you not only have a hope for the future, an eternal hope because of Christ's death and resurrection. Know that God is not only with you in the midst of it because of what Christ has done, has established you with a relationship with him, but know that through the example of Christ, what we see is that God enters into the suffering and he is at work in the midst of the suffering. He is at work in the midst of the difficult times to bring about the greatest good. That as we keep our focus on Jesus, we realize that in the difficult times when the pressure is on, that's when the diamond is formed. That God is at work in you during the difficult times to form you, to shape you. When you feel like there's a weight bearing down on you, God is at work. As you look to him, as you keep your focus on Jesus, that time is not wasted. God is at work. And God is at work not only in you, but through you. Just as he worked through the suffering of Christ for the good of others, through the suffering of Joseph for the good of others, he is at work in our hard times, in our difficult times, for the good of others. It's in our difficult times that so often opportunities are created for us to be able to share Jesus with others, to be able to share the reason for the hope that we have, the reason that we have a smile on our face in the midst of what we're going through. And I love the way that Peter finishes these verses. As he calls us to keep focused on Jesus, he reminds us that the cross and resurrection isn't just an event that happened in the past, but it established Jesus' victory that is outworked in the present. That right now, today, Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. Jesus is on the throne with angels and authorities and powers under his feet. He is seated with power over all things. The enemy may prowl around like a lion, but he is toothless. His teeth have been removed. He is under Jesus' feet. We do not need to fear what they fear. We do not need to be intimidated, but in our hearts revere Christ as Lord, knowing that he is on the throne. We are living through difficult days and they have dragged on a lot longer than any of us expected. But as much as we might want things in the world to change, we don't have to wait for that in order to know good days. God has good days for us, good days for you, blessings for you, right now, today, in the midst of the difficulties. And to experience those good days, to step into those good days, to position ourselves to receive God's blessing, Peter encourages us to seek peace, to be prepared, and to focus on Jesus. He is the source of our hope and our joy.